So let's dive in. I'm just going to go through the Herrick chapter pretty quickly here. Chapter 4, Aristotle on Rhetoric, and just sort of draw your attention to the kind of stuff that I'm going to be going into more detail into the reading itself. So in the 6th edition, this is page 82, chapter 4. Herrick starts out by noting that Aristotle came to Athens at a time where the kind of Gorgias moment had come and gone. Gorgias had been teaching in Athens. Let's see, he had arrived in the city-state 60 years earlier, and he had died 13 years earlier. So Gorgias had died over a decade before Aristotle showed up. Aristotle studied with Plato. He was a student of Plato. And we're going to read, I think, the Socrates piece Against the Sophists, where he starts talking about sort of the different schools of rhetorical instruction. And he's kind of going at the sophistic school, and he's kind of going at Plato's school as well. These are some of the major rivals and different kinds of approaches to rhetorical education, philosophical education, and so on. But Aristotle was basically a Platonist in his earlier years, but then he found his kind of own way. He became a much more kind of scientific. What they mean when they say scientific back then is basically just dealing with like the natural world, right? Like the physical world, the empirical world, the world that we can see and touch and feel and measure and so on. Aristotle is very empirical, and I think that's important for his approach to rhetoric, which is a very sort of technical and systematic and pragmatic approach. And if I haven't yet mentioned it, of all of the models that we're going to look at, Aristotle's is, I think, the most important, certainly conceptually, in terms of his ideas, his theories, theorizing about the kind of the process of rhetoric. And right at the heart of all of this is this video, or this concept of the enthymeme. And I created a separate video for the enthymeme. Sorry, my printer is just cleaning itself. Gets really loud. Hope you can hear okay. I created that video on the enthymeme, I think it was this past summer for a class I was teaching. So there's some stuff at the beginning that might not make sense because I'm talking about a class previously. So just kind of start focusing in when I talk about the concepts. But it's an important enough single concept that I wanted to devote an entire video just to the enthymeme. So please do watch that in addition to our conversation here about these ideas. I tried to do a deeper dive on what the enthymeme is and how it operates, because it's right at the heart of his whole take on rhetoric. So let's see, at the top of the next page 84, it says, in Rhetoric, Aristotle sets out a systematic approach to the subject for the benefit of his more advanced students, and in an effort to legitimate the study of rhetoric in his school, the Lyceum. Avoiding the moralizing tone of his teacher Plato of 20 years, Aristotle's approach to rhetoric was pragmatic and scientific. Pragmatic in the sense that it was always thinking about the actual kind of practical application of these ideas of technical persuasion and technical skill and so on. So he was very much interested in the actualities of how people attempt to persuade, and the sort of the highest possibilities of the process. So the stuff on rhetoric and dialectic we'll get into in a moment here, but it's important. We'll see that for Aristotle, rhetoric and dialectic were basically almost like flip sides of the same kind of activity. So we'll see what their distinctions are. There's a great chart on page 85 there that kind of lays all this out, and what the difference between a dialectical engagement is versus a rhetorical engagement. So you can kind of look through that. This business on the next page, 86, rhetoric as a techne of discovery, is super important, right? So recall the 5 canons of rhetoric, the 5 parts of the art. There's invention, arrangement, style, delivery, memory, right? And for Aristotle, invention is like the whole game. So this is basically an approach to rhetoric that's really thinking hard about the business of invention, the business of discovering one's available persuasives, to use his language, right? So it's the business of finding the ways in which we attempt to persuade others or attempt to connect with others. That's the discovery part, and that's connected to invention, right? So keep that in mind. The stuff on why rhetoric is useful, we'll hit that briefly when we go through the first 3 chapters, but there's 4 reasons on these 2 pages here that are quite good. But basically, rhetoric is useful not only because it it requires us to sort of think through our own case, that discovery business, but also in that process, we're learning more about our opponent's case, right? So we're able to better challenge others, and we're also able to better anticipate challenges. And this is a very sort of, you can see this as a kind of strengthening process of like, if I know your best arguments and you know my best arguments, then we can kind of ready ourselves and the whole thing improves. That's the idea, sort of the debate idea. All right, so on the enthymeme is on the next page here, and just a couple quick things to note about the enthymeme. We'll get back to this, but the enthymeme is a deductive argument, like the syllabus, like the dialectical syllogism, but it's called the rhetorical syllogism. My goodness, but it's deductive. And at the bottom of that page 88, it says, "It is clear that Aristotle held rhetoric to be constructed of arguments and appeals involving beliefs shared by speaker and audience." So it's a deductive argument, and it involves a ground of shared ideas, values, assumptions, and so on. That's sort of the two key parts there. The next page, that middle paragraph, and right here, citing Lloyd Bitzer here, noted that the enthymeme's successful construction is accomplished through the joint efforts of speaker and audience, and this is its essential character. So this is what we're going to learn about the enthymeme, is that it's about a co-construction of an idea that requires both sides. So this is why the Aristotelian model is collateral, not unilateral. It's collateral and symmetrical. And this whole business is good for democracy. That's the last kind of key idea there. Then Herrick moves into the three rhetorical settings, which we'll talk about there as well toward the end, and the artistic proofs and the inartistic proofs, and we'll get into that stuff as well. He's going through this stuff pretty thoroughly for a single chapter, and he's hitting kind of most of the key ideas. The very end here, 96, the topoi, the lines of argument, we'll hope to get to that as well. And if we can get all of that okay, then we have a pretty good handle on Aristotle's rhetoric. So you'll notice on the website that I posted a number of things to help with Aristotle. The main things that you want to be sort of focusing on, the Herrick chapter that we just went through, just those kind of key parts there. The notes that I posted, which gives some kind of biographical stuff. It's like an extension of Herrick. It gives some biographical stuff, but it also gives like the outline of the On Rhetoric, which is pretty important. You kind of see the breakdown of the entire thing. Then I just cut and pasted from the link to the entirety of On Rhetoric. I just cut and pasted the first 3 chapters of the first book. These are the 3 crucial kind of overview chapters where he covers basically all of his key ideas on rhetoric. So I wanted to have those as a kind of reading, and I put page numbers on it so that we can refer to it together. So that's the most important reading on Aristotle that you're going to want to be doing for this model this week of reading. By all means, look through the full thing. By all means, go through my outline and the notes. But in terms of like what you need to sort of focus on, it's these 7 or 8 pages here. All right, and I'm going to go through the key moments. I also have, as I mentioned, the video on the enthymeme. Go ahead and check that out in addition to this one. And then I actually just posted a kind of bonus thing that I just discovered. I was going through YouTube looking at different things, and I found this video by this dude who I don't even know, but he's got a pretty good take on rhetoric, persuasion, and from a kind of Aristotelian perspective. He starts off by talking about this interesting stuff about the rider and the elephant, this business of sort of our conscious right thoughts and our non-conscious thoughts, and how rhetoric kind of works with both. It's quite good. You don't have to watch it, but it's helpful. And it kind of might snap some of these Aristotelian ideas into focus a little bit more. So with that, let's take a look at the first 3 chapters. These are, like I said, these are the key chapters. And Aristotle starts out by talking about the relationship between rhetoric and dialectic. Go back to that page in Herrick if you want to kind of get good on this. But basically, rhetoric is a process of engaging with a wide audience, a large audience, a mixed audience, an audience of non-experts on a matter of kind of particular local situated tension, right? There's some decision needs to be made, some problem needs to be addressed, right? It's dealing with some kind of immediate local problem, more or less, right? That's why it's known as kind of pragmatic and situated. It's dealing with real here and now type events. Whereas dialectic is this kind of smaller, think about Plato's dialogues. Those are dialectical exchanges where you have one or two or three or just a few people kind of talking about a very specific question, but it's a big philosophical question, right? So dialectic deals with sort of big truths. Like, how do we know what the purpose of life is? What is the purpose of a job? What is the purpose of war, right? It's like big questions. And we get to our answers by kind of back and forth and testing and challenging. And we're really engaged in a strict kind of analytical exercise here. Rhetoric, he says, is the counterpart to dialectic. So it's related in the sense that it's this business of kind of exchange with an audience, but it's a very different kind of an exchange. It's an exchange in which the speaker is attempting to move an audience in a certain way. How do you do that? Aristotle's really interested in the how part of that process, which is why he's so useful. Now he says in the next paragraph, so this is first page, second paragraph here. He makes his first mention of enthymemes. He says, these writers say nothing about enthymemes, which are the substance of rhetorical persuasion, right? So everything in Aristotle's understanding of rhetoric really kind of comes down to the enthymeme as the substance, or elsewhere I've seen it written as the body of persuasion, enthymemes. All right, so we'll get back to that in a second. And in terms of that first chapter, go to the second page and the second full paragraph right there in the middle. He says, it is clear then that rhetorical study in its strictest sense is concerned with the modes of persuasion. He's tipping off these three modes of persuasion that other video on, it's actually got some stuff on Mr. Rogers, which is so great, but it covers the three modes of persuasion: ethos, pathos, logos, right? Those are the artistic proofs, the artistic modes of appeal, which we'll see in a second. Persuasion is clearly a sort of demonstration, he says. Now, this is a key idea, right? What's a demonstration? It's something that we believe to have been shown, right? It's like, oh, I've seen it, or I've sort of come into a place of belief because something has been proven in a kind of almost like a visual sense, even if it's not like actually visible, but like in your brain you can sort of see it, right? So it's demonstrated in the sense that its proven power has taken root within you, and that's enthymematic. We'll see and how that works. So the orator's demonstration is an enthymeme. All right, now in the next major paragraph, he gets into the why rhetoric is useful. Don't forget that chunk in Herrick where he goes through the 4 reasons that rhetoric is useful. That's where he's doing it right there. I'm going to skip over that because it's good, but there's other stuff that's more crucial. All right, so it says part 2 here, but I usually just think of it as chapter 2 because this is book 1 of 3 books, and then we've got the third, or this is now the second chapter or part. Sorry. But anyway, the beginning of chapter 2 or part 2 here is where we get Aristotle's great, awesome, legendary, famous definition of rhetoric. So much is packed into just a few words here. He says, rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, right? Boom, there you go. So the key stuff here is this faculty. It's an ability or it's a capacity. I've seen power, right? So one's ability, and obviously that's a variable thing, right? I have a different ability, you have a different ability, I have a different ability today than I did tomorrow, but it's this idea of, in any given case, what is one's ability to what? To observe. This gets back to that discovery idea, right? It's about discovering the available persuasive, the available appeals that one's able to use. So in any given case, whether it's today, whether it's now, whether it's here, whether it's there, whether it's this audience, that audience, right? Me, someone else, in any given or specific case, what's available? The available means of persuasion. Just think about a situation, a kind of persuasive situation. What's available, right? It's hard to know that without knowing the particularities of the actual situation, the particularities of the audience, the occasion, the purpose, right? Who you're dealing with, who the rhetor is, what their level of training or knowledge or exposure or whatever, right? Open-mindedness. There's so many different variables and factors that go into this, but this is a great way of thinking about what we're doing. is that ability to discover our available persuasives. So heavy emphasis on invention as discovery. All right. Two more paragraphs down, he starts mentioning the three modes of appeal, right? So he says, of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first depends on the personal character of the speaker, that's ethos. The second on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, that's pathos. And the third on the proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself, that's logos, right? So you've got my character, my ability to arouse certain moods or emotions in the audience, and then the ideas coming through the words that I use and how I arrange them, and the logical sequencing and the support and bringing things together and breaking things apart, right? So that the level of ideas and how they're expressed through the certain layout of the appeals, right? So those are the three modes of appeal. He calls them artistic because the speaker has some kind of creative license over them, right? You can presumably affect different kinds of outcomes if you play on different emotions or arouse different emotions. You can affect different outcomes if you modulate your own ethos in terms of sincerity, in terms of urgency, in terms of formality, style, tone, right? How you come across can have a big impact one way or another. And so on, right? So there's an artistry. That's why they're artistic proofs. I'm actually writing an essay right now on thinking about algorithms as inartistic proofs, and these things that are persuasive, but we don't really have any kind of artistic control over them. They move us around in ways that we're not really aware of oftentimes, and yet they're powerful, right? So he talks about, just very briefly, he talks about inartistic proofs, these weird things that we don't have any control over, we just use them. Things like contracts or witnesses and so on. So the artistic proof means that we have, again, creative or inventional kind of control over these things. Now, the key thing that I want to draw your attention to, this is on page 4 in the reading, and it's the second big paragraph right here. He says, with regard to the persuasion achieved by proof or apparent proof, just as in dialectic there is induction on the one hand and syllogism or apparent syllogism on the other, so it is in rhetoric. The example is an induction, the enthymeme is a syllogism, and the apparent enthymeme is an apparent syllogism. He says, I call the enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism and the example a rhetorical induction. So let's pause here. Now, this is where that other video will go deeper, right? So, but what's important, again, this is the rhetorical syllogism or the enthymeme is a deductive argument that relies on the shared understanding of speaker and audience, right? So he says we've got two different kinds of argument. We've got deductive arguments and inductive arguments, right? Inductive arguments work from the particular to the general. So it's like an example, right? It's like, I love Mexican food because that one Mexican place that I went to had really good Mexican food. And then the next place, or let's say like Cincinnati, Ohio has great Mexican food because I went to 2 Mexican restaurants and they were both really good. That's an inductive argument. You're drawing a generalization from a very small sample. We do this all the time, right? Because we live lives of discrete local experiences and we draw these conclusions out of them, right? So that's moving from the particular to the general. That's induction. Deduction works oppositely. Deduction operates from the general to the particular, right? So you can be walking around and you can say, oh, I'm going to Ohio or Cincinnati or whatever I just said, and I would sure love to have some Mexican food, but like there's no way I'm going to go out for Mexican food when I'm in Cincinnati because what are you operating from? An assumption that says something like there can't be good Mexican food in Ohio because everyone's super white and European or who knows right? But we're operating from a deductive assumption about Ohio, right? And so that sense, the general idea, there's no good Mexican food in Cincinnati, is driving our local and particular kind of experiences. So the deductive moves from a principle, a big broad principle, down to a particular, all right? So induction goes from the particular to the general. Deduction goes from the general to the particular. So those are the two kind of argument types. And then he breaks them down in terms of we've got dialectic and we've got rhetoric. A deductive argument in dialectic is called a syllogism. A deductive argument for rhetoric is called an enthymeme. An inductive argument for dialectic is called, he just calls it induction or paradigm example. And then in rhetoric, same kind of thing, right? So both rhetoric and dialectic sort of similarly work inductively from examples. He also calls them paradigms, just a specific case, specific kind of example. But dialectic has its syllogism, rhetoric has its enthymeme, right? And so enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism. What does that mean? All right. So a syllogism, the usual example of a syllogism is, classic textbook example is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. What makes that a dialectical syllogism is that first statement, all. All. Think all. All means what? All. It means we are certain of this truth. We are certain, 100% certain of this principle. All men are mortal. There's no one walking around who's more than 110 years old, right? There's no 3,000-year-old person walking around. And if you are a 3,000-year-old person, you're probably not mortal. You're probably a vampire, right? So the principle holds. All men are mortal. Here's a particular man, therefore that man is mortal, right? That's a deductive argument. The only difference between the two, between a syllogism and an enthymeme, is the all. All applies to the syllogism. That's dialectic. That's certain. Don't forget, the Platonic model is all about certainty, right? The Aristotelian model is all about probability. So the difference there is that the deduction is not from an all statement, it's from a most statement, right? That's the realm of the probable. The realm of the probable is the more and the less. So you're going to Cincinnati, and the assumption in your head is most Midwestern, cities have crap Mexican food. That's probably something you can imagine that being like an assumption that you have, right? You come into Cincinnati, you've got this assumption in your mind. You happen to end up at some Mexican place, and you're blown away, right? So it's like, oh my goodness, this is an exception to my probabilistic statement or my probabilistic assumption. I was wrong. My probabilistic statement was maybe only about 9% true, and so I'm on the wrong side of that probability, right? The key point here is that with Aristotle and the enthymeme, we're not dealing with all statements, right? That's the syllogism. All men are mortal. All children are innocent. All Americans are go-getters. I don't know. The enthymeme doesn't work that way. The enthymeme works on most or generally or often, or it's that variable realm of the probable, which means we're not dealing with 100%, we're not dealing with 0%, we're dealing with sort of the in-between and that meaty middle part. Just think about how we do this all the time. We all kind of engage in enthymematic processes because, we're always just assuming what each other's might think or believe or what kind of knowledge we share. So, advertisements work this way. They draw on assumptions like you're the kind of person who deserves a blank. You work hard. Yes, I'm someone who works hard. I care about these things, right? It's this more kind of murky, slippery realm of the more and the less, right? So I got a couple of examples in my enthymeme video that you can dive into. But the basic gist is any time that a speaker is attempting to make a connection with an audience, they're oftentimes doing it by saying things that don't require explanation because they're assumed, right? So like if I come into an audience and, oh my goodness, everyone's wearing a sports jersey that says, who just won the Super Bowl? Kansas City. So what are they, the Chiefs? Right? Everyone's wearing a Chiefs jersey. You could probably make some assumptions about your audience and what they care about and what they like and what they don't like. So you could make a joke with that audience about the 49ers and something like, well, guys, you sure look great. You sure look handsome. Definitely not Niners fans. And they're going to like, oh, yay, right? And so what you're doing is you're hooking into a shared assumption, the assumption being like the Chiefs rule, right, or something like that. You don't have to say it. You kind of just know it. You intuit it. You infer it. All right, so the enthymeme is a method of device that's working on inference. I'm inferring certain knowledge about you, and it's like a guess. I'm going fishing, right? I'm going to assume, based on the fact that everyone's wearing these jerseys, that everyone's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. Knowing that, I can develop certain appeals, and I can, flatter Midwestern folks, and I can start making jokes about those San Francisco liberal progressives out there, and who knows what, right? And I can draw on all these different assumptions about Kansas City. I can draw on assumptions about San Francisco, about the different teams, about life in those different cities, and I can bend audiences kind of based off of that, but I can only bend them if I establish that connection, and the connection is the enthymeme. So when you go back to that moment where on the very first page where he says enthymemes are the substance of rhetorical persuasion, the reason that they are the substance or the body of rhetorical persuasion is because they establish a connection between a rhetor and their audience through some shared assumptions, shared understandings, values, memories, maybe even prejudices, good, bad, the other, right? This is the realm of the shared. I can only move you if I can tap into something that you already believe or feel or value, or, right? So that whole process of connecting with an audience, oftentimes on not even a conscious level, is enthymematic. And it's the whole business of persuasion. Think about how many ads are appealing to your sense of pride, vanity, laziness, convenience, whatever. They're trying to tap into these values, these moods to get you. And once they've gotten you, if you watch that video with that guy who's talking about Mr. Rogers, he's talking about like, we don't appeal so much to just like conscious beliefs a lot of the times. We're appealing to what he calls the elephant, which is the like 90% of who we are is sort of below conscious awareness. So you're tapping into moods, values, sensibilities, things that are a lot more kind of, within us, deep within us, than just like certain ideas that we share. So if you get that business of like the enthymematic process of attempting to hook into shared beliefs, then you're in pretty good shape for like what Aristotle's up to in terms of how he's thinking about persuasion. From there, and I'm moving on to 30 minutes, he talks about signs and probabilities as being sort of the major resources of this enthymematic persuasion. And the last thing to kind of note, I guess, would be the three genres or the species of rhetoric, right? So he gets into this in part 3, chapter 3, page 6. He says rhetoric falls into 3 divisions determined by the 3 classes of listeners. So we have two classes of listeners: those that are being asked to judge on action, and one class of listeners is just being sort of asked to kind of judge the display, right? So the 2 kinds of action are split in terms of time. Past action is forensic, so the audience is judging on past wrongdoings. Future action is deliberative or political, and that's the audience is being asked to judge about future actions. Should we go to war? Should we build a wall? Should we, install this security program? Whatever. So we got judicial, we got deliberative, and then the third one is not action, it's display. That's epideictic. And these are speeches of like praise and blame, and it's about the moment, right? So like an inaugural speech, a State of the Union speech, a wedding toast, a funeral oration. Those are the 3 occasions that rhetoric happens. So we have these occasions. In each of these occasions, we're always being enthymematic. Speakers are always trying to hook into audience using ethos, logos, and pathos, right? So if you get all that, you're in pretty good shape. The last kind of twist here is this business of topoi. These are topics, right? So when we find ourselves in a judicial occasion, our enthymemes are going to be built around these specific kinds of topics. When we are in a judicial occasion, the kinds of things we talk about, he says in here, have to do with wrongdoing, have to do with harm, have to do with like why people do harm, and so on. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about. These are the topoi, the places that we're going to develop our enthymemes. When we're in a deliberative or a political occasion, the topics, the things we tend to talk about, again, probabilistically speaking, we just tend to talk about these things. We talk about war, we talk about finances, we talk about defense, we talk about trade, and so on, right? Those are the topoi, those are the places that we're going to develop our enthymemes. In a epideictic occasion, the topics are around praise and blame, right? So if it's a funeral oration, you're going to praise, you're going to talk about these elements of this person's character, things they've done. If it's a, you don't find too many speeches of blame, but you can, right? Like an opposition party type speech. Thinking about like after the State of the Union, there's usually the response from the opposition party, right? That's a pretty good example of blame. And so on, right? So that's pretty much the gist of at least the kind of the overview of Aristotle's on rhetoric. We've covered rhetoric and dialectic. We've covered what an enthymeme or rhetorical syllogism is. Don't forget, it's deductive and it's about audience connection over shared assumptions. The three modes of appeal, ethos, logos, pathos. Those are always in play, no matter our occasion. But for Aristotle, there's three main occasions, and that's the forensic, judicial, political, deliberative, and epidictic or ceremonial. I know that's a lot packed into only about 30 minutes. I'm trying to keep these videos to around 30 minutes at most, but Aristotle is really stuffed with important stuff. So please do look through the Herrick chapter. It should correspond pretty well with what I've just talked about and what we've covered in those first three chapters. Do also take a look at those notes that I put together from previous versions of this class. The rest of the stuff is there for your, for your help in terms of those other two videos. But then also to be looking at the next reading, which is, this is a new one, Creating with the Universe of the Undiscussed. I'm eager to get into this and see what a contemporary, thinking about Aristotle in the context of like media, digital stuff should be interesting. So look forward to that video and hope all's well out there, gang. Peace.